Great things are done when men and mountains meet. This is not done by jostling in the street. William Blake. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I would like to thank everyone who's been continuing to listen and who has listened, for those who have listened a while, and for those who are maybe just joining us now. So last week's episode, I had some really good feedback in response to that, and I do want to thank everyone. I do apologize again for it being out late. But it did have a couple of pieces of feedback that I wanted to follow up with, and as well as something that I think I forgot to mention when I went over the recording. First, I think I neglected to mention that Cyprus has possibly the oldest evidence of domesticated cats. I went into that in a lot more detail in our animal domestication episode, but I meant to mention again and bring it back up. Who knows, maybe that's what they were trading for obsidian. Maybe they had cornered the market on cats. The other thing I want to mention was something that I should have been a little bit more clear on, and I would like to thank a couple of my listeners for asking about it so I can clarify and just expand on and explain. So these episodes run from 8,000 to about 6,000 BC. And while I have been focusing on groups associated with the PrePottery Neolithic, pottery is beginning to be used at the end of this time frame, at the very end, in locations near the sites we have been and will be discussing, which is just so again, this is ending just before or right after 6000 BC. So groups that develop and use pottery are beginning to leave more traces on the archaeological record and then slowly become the more prominent groups of the region. Sites that exhibit this early pottery are usually referred to as Pottery Neolithic, and there is an overlap between the time frame and the PrePottery Neolithic B or PrePottery Neolithic C, if some sites use that. Eventually, the Pottery Neolithic will overtake the PrePottery Neolithic in terms of number of people. So much so that when we return to these sites and areas at the 6,000 to either 4,500 or 4,000 BC, I'm not quite sure on the exact timeline yet, those episodes will focus more on groups using pottery because they will have become more distinct and identifiable in the record. So it is a confusing period where we're in now with a bit of overlap, at least in the last 400 to 500 years. Now, I thought about bringing these people up last time, and maybe I should have with the feedback I got, but I figured Cyprus kind of deserved its own episode, its own focus. But now in the Southern Levant, we focused primarily on Jericho, but there were a few other smaller sites in the same region that share a certain level of continuity or maybe even cohesion with the site at Jericho. Sites like Ain Ghazal and Tell Aswad each share a certain level of similarity with Jericho. At times they were all co-occupied. Ain Ghazal has lime and plaster statuary and figurines of humans and some animals like Jericho did, but even more have been recovered from Ain Ghazal than even at Jericho, though Ain Ghazal was nowhere quite as big, at least in terms of population. Both had plastered skulls, like Jericho did during the PP&B period. Though I think I should point out that though there is some level of overlap between these sites, when they were cohabited at the same time, they were not all lived in during the exact same time periods. Tell Aswad was not lived in, at least on a semi-permanent or permanent basis during the pre-pottery Neolithic period, the A period, the pre-pottery Neolithic A period. They also each had their own slight differences or innovations. Tel Aswad, like Jericho, had walls, but unlike Jericho, their walls were not made of stone, but layered levels of compressed soil and reeds. This hints at some factors that will come up when I do our urbanization special, but just think of these as more earthworks than stoneworks. The stone walls at Jericho were made from stone. For now, though, I need to finish this area by talking about the invention of pottery, which happens around 6400 BC, give or take 100 years. This takes place in a relatively small area. It happens around the Sea of Galilee, somewhere in the border regions of Israel, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon. This pottery and its creators are called Yarmoukyan. This name comes from the Yarmouk River, which is the largest tributary of the Jordan River. They have a number of small settlements, not more than a town or maybe even a village. The pottery is simple. Some of them have little ring holes around the lips, I guess, to maybe help pour, or maybe tie a rope through to help carry, a large number. But I didn't notice that on any of the things they've recovered that they have any kind of special molded mouths. They're literally just circular. They're also lightly decorated with lines and kind of arrows. Literally just straight lines, kind of parallel to each other, and in those parallel lines, they will have just the tops of triangles made from two lines, kind of incised inward to each other, so kind of making very rudimentary arrows. And I didn't see that any of these, at least any of the ones that have been recovered, they didn't have any kind of overt human or animal figures. It's almost entirely geometric shapes. Nothing human or animal. This pottery and culture disappeared after around 400 years. So right at the 6000 BC mark. It's possible they only made, pottery for 100 or so years before, they kind of joined up with other groups, or other groups kind of took their invention and ran with it. Now, there is another potential culture to the south of pre-pottery Neolithic B Jericho and the Yarmoukyan territory that used pottery, and it is called Nizanim. There are only a couple of sites that have been, kind of tentatively tied to this group. Only around 3 or so. The time frame they existed in is up for debate. Only one of their sites was able to come up with radiocarbon dating, and that was in the mid 5000s BC, so like 5500, 5600. And this put it later than what the archaeologist who had discovered and examined these sites had dated them to. They had thought them contemporaries with the Yarmoukyan, but just the nature of their sites and the lack of stratigraphic clues make this very hard to prove. This group was very nomadic. It did not have nearly as many sedentary or semi-sedentary sites to study. There's also some politics involved that I'm not going to get into, but I think it's fair to say that this group probably didn't exist as a cohesive unit until later, if they existed at all. But I'll cover more of them in the next set of episodes on this region. Now, we're going to continue to do a little bit of moving up to the north. There is a gap in sedentary locations in the Levant. Once you move past kind of where the Yarmoukhian culture is located and Jericho is located, you get kind of a dead space. Although that's not a good term. It's not so much a dead space. It's just a space where there are no long-term sites, or at least we've not discovered any long-term sites. This area is kind of one of those ectones we've talked about. It kind of passes through the anti-Lebanon mountains, or the eastern mountains of Lebanon, which is what that literally means. So there's kind of a space where you have those ectones, where you have these different geographic regions meeting together. You have these cedar forests up and down the coast of Lebanon that people aren't necessarily trying to establish permanent settlements in. They're just kind of moving through them seasonally. Excuse me. Sorry for that notification. So this is a region that is not kind of one of those experimental regions, probably because they don't really have the best environment for the kind of agriculture that people are currently practicing. And so you see this kind of unurbanized area from what is Tel Assad, which is kind of to the north and slightly to the west of Jericho. That's kind of the last of the proto-cities in the region. And then you basically have this verdant, wild landscape stretching in a curve all the way to the Euphrates River, where you begin to see a number of sites in that region. And then from there, you have sites to the north in what are Anatolia, and then you have sites either further to the east past the Tigris, and then you have some locations in kind of the Zagros mountain area. You also have a few outlier sites to the west in Anatolia along the coast. And we're going to talk about a few of those here in the next couple of episodes. But the big sites that you would find along the Euphrates are Abu Hureyra, Tell Mureybet, and a couple of other smaller ones. But I think the big one that we should focus on for this episode is Abu Hureyra. Now, when I mentioned the Natuthian a few episodes ago and how a couple of their sites had been flooded, that would be Abu Hureyra and Mureybet. These were flooded, I believe, in the 70s after the construction of the Aswad Dam, I believe is what it's called. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's the Tabqa Dam, but it created Lake Assad. This was part of kind of a modernization and agricultural project of Hafez al-Assad, who is the father, of course, of Bashir al-Assad, the current dictator of Syria. And during, basically, in the run-up to this flooding happening, because they knew that this would happen once the dam was finished construction, kind of an emergency excavation was done in the region. A large number of artifacts were kind of cataloged and, excavated and dug up and then transported for future study. So this has happened over quite a period, over 20 some odd years, that this kind of analysis happened, and study of the artifacts. So it's unfortunate. Who knows, there could have been things missed, but from what we have been able to save and gather, Abu Hureyra was very similar to Tel Es Sultan, or the ancient Jericho site. It had been inhabited, by this kind of early pre-pottery group that were mostly hunter-gatherers. They would mostly eat wild gazelle and deer, and then they would supplement, of course, their diet with random odds and ends of wild plants in the area. There's a period of dryness that happens during what is the Younger Dryas period, and that probably affected the wild plants because it was a little bit drier, so that probably led them to practice some form of cultivation and trying to get plant these crops. In fact, there is some theories that hold that Abu Hureyra may have been one of the first sites that this was attempted at. But like Jericho, it does have a transitional period where it is not occupied. There are those that think that the bulk of the population that was living here moved to Mureybet, which is a little bit to the north and east of Abu Hureyra, and that site seems to have a larger population while this site loses it. So there's about a 1,000 to a 1,500 year period where the site is virtually abandoned. So you go from this hunter-gatherer PrePottery Neolithic A site where there is a lot of more wild food sources, and then you have this switch to a domesticated site around 7,000 or so BCE. This site holds a large number of domesticated crop sources that they've been able to find, or I say large number. There were more domesticated strains than wild strains, we'll put it that way. Wild grasses, einkorn, emmer, those make up the bulk, but there is also probably about 15-20% of lentils as well. So they have a fairly diverse plant diet, if nothing else. And of course, they're probably beginning to rely on domesticated animals more as well. Though I couldn't get the breakdown of bones at the site the way I could at Jericho. But Abu Hureyra is kind of a very interesting case because it was while they were doing the excavation, they did like a kind of experimental digging process to find these plants that they were able to study. This has led some to kind of be a little skeptical of some of the claims of that this was like one of the first areas that they were practicing agriculture. But, it's very slight disagreement. They're just saying that, they're basically overstating the importance of the site. But there is no denying that it is a very old site for agricultural practice. They don't believe the evidence proves that it is the first. So, unfortunately, due to the nature of the area and it now being underwater, it's kind of hard to, prove that anymore. But say what you want, the area did need a big jolt in agriculture just due to the modern day environment, and the water was desperately needed in Syria. Whatever else your opinion of the Assad family, that is something that probably needed to be done for them to be able to support their population. Of course, other issues came about from that, but we'll get into that stuff well into the future. So yeah, you have about a 1,300 year period where Abu Hureyra was pretty much abandoned. I'm sure it was still used as kind of a camping spot. It had been used that way, long before anyone even thought of doing sedentary life. And it's kind of a good place. It's up on a mount overlooking this plateau overlooking the Euphrates, so you'd have a good view of the area. Relatively, even terrain at that elevation. So, it was a good spot. But during the kind of younger Dryas period, where it was a lot drier, it's thought that due to the lack of natural rainfall, people started caring more for crops that they themselves had planted because it needed it more. So it was probably a low scale agriculture. I could not get kind of a estimate of how large this site was, but it was not nearly as large as Jericho, at least in terms of population. Let's see. It's about 75 miles east of modern day Aleppo, or it was, I should say. So it's not far off from the modern capital of the area. In fact, it's been a capital for quite a while. So it's, in the grand scheme of things, very close. It's very central. When you get to more organized states, it's a good location, is basically what I'm trying to say. I think just due to the size of the plateau it's on, it probably couldn't support too large of a population. That's probably why in the future bigger sites were a little bit more to the west, despite the fact that you're on the Euphrates. I think just due to the nature of the river itself, it was probably not the most stable region environmentally to place a capital, which is again probably why you see the capital of the region kind of centered a little bit more to its west. But there are a number of factors for that, and we'll get into that in future when we kind of go through, I guess, the centralization of cities in the region and power and all that kind of good stuff when it comes to states. Let's see. So that's the highlights kind of Abu Hureyra. I do want to talk a little bit about its sister site, Mureybet. Mureybet was probably in the kind of same seasonal rotation and occupation by hunter-gatherer groups, specifically the Natufian. The population rose in the area after the abandonment or semi-abandonment of Abu Hureyra. And it was but it was occupied permanently or a semi-permanent basis slightly before then. So it's probably that the populations at Abu Hureyra were probably a little too large for what kind of resources they were looking at. So they may have split, and then, they would kind of, travel back and forth as needed. But Mureybet is also kind of affected by the lake being formed due to the dam. So it was also likewise kind of speedily excavated. But from what they could tell, it looks like Mureybet, had been abandoned fully by about 8,000 BC. But at that period, they did find, these evidences of domesticated animals. At the very least, a decent number of them. Not as much, of course, as they were still eating wild animals or wild deer and things like that. But they did have that to kind of supplement. And then it appears that this site is abandoned completely at that point, and perhaps they either all move into Abu Hureyra or they set up a different site nearby Abu Hureyra, and that kind of becomes the new secondary location for these people. Now, there are a couple of other sites that are in modern Syria. They're a little bit smaller. But most of the ones dating to this period are in and around this general area. You have, the Euphrates is nearby, but you also have mountains and even a plain. There is a little small plain that's kind of bounded by the Taurus Mountains to the north and the Lebanese mountains to the south and east. But you do have this plain, and then that is bounded by the Euphrates to its east. So it was probably a decent place for these early herders, if nothing else. Probably not the best place to practice agriculture just yet. They still are developing techniques. That's probably why you don't see quite the numbers that you would have at Jericho or some other places. But yeah, so that's kind of what we have in modern day Syria. Now, next time, and I think this is a good place to call this episode, we're going to start talking about the sites in Anatolia and how they might have been related to these sites in Syria, the sites further south, as well as to sites that we're going to cover to the east in the future. But there are a number of sites in the southern Anatolia, specifically Göbekli Tepe, Catalhoyuk, Karahan Tepe. There are a few, and this is probably going to be an episode or two just on them. We're going to talk a lot about kind of possible religious or cultural institutions that are developing, and kind of break down what these sites may have been used for, because it's not 100% that all of these sites were used as a residence. They could have been ceremonial centers, something that is, not necessarily the precursor of a temple or a temple complex, but it could have been. And as we'll see, a lot of cities in the future will develop around temple complexes or become homes to gods for specific groups. And again, we'll go all into that a little bit more detail later. But first, we're going to deal with these groups in Anatolia. I could not find any information about the possible religious practices at Abu Hureyra and at Mureybet. They might have been kind of abandoned a little too soon. I think there are, of course, like stone, like vases, or not vases, but just stone containers, and I know they had baskets and things like that, but I could not find any kind of sources on any kind of cultural artifacts they had. They did have jewelry, they had seashell jewelry, things like that, but I didn't see anything about any kind of possible religious figures. But I think there is a general opinion that it's very similar to what you would find at Jericho. At least that's the theory. I'll get into that a little bit more next week. But there's not an overt kind of symbol or, potential symbols, I guess the case may be. But we'll dive into that a little bit more next week. For now, though, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Next week's episode should be out regularly. Next weekend is a long weekend here in the U.S. It is Martin Luther King Day, or at least it is for me. I know not everyone gets that day off, but my goal is to have the episode recorded and uploaded at the regular time. But it may be the next day. I doubt it, but just in case, I'm going to give myself a little bit of leeway. But I hope you enjoyed. If you have any feedback, please email me at waradrevpod@gmail.com. I do love hearing from people. You can also direct message me at Twitter, which I will include my Twitter link in the episode description. Anyway, I hope you if you enjoyed this episode. And yeah, thank you again. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.